let's get going on this conversation. I'm really excited. I'm so excited to be here with Amina, who is the CEO of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, if you don't know her. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, like Amina said, it feels a little bit like we're on a talk show here. But we're going to have a deep conversation about leadership in the era of accountability. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think a lot of you may have heard about the SAC or heard, or read about things in the news, and I want to get into the details and hear it straight from the source. So I guess before we get really deep, can you give us a little background on what the SAC is and kind of what some of your goals are as an organization?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's really great to be here. We've never actually been at this conference before, either in person or virtually, so it's really nice to be out and to be engaging with a different audience. So thanks for the opportunity. I'm going to start maybe with a little bit of background on the SAC and kind of the origin story, because I really feel like that speaks to who we are and what we're trying to do. So in 2009, two very unlikely partners came together, Patagonia and Walmart, to actually bring the industry together from a pre-competitive space to talk about how the industry was going to address sustainability. And if you can imagine, in 2009, companies coming together to sit around a table and talk about things was actually not the norm. And when companies got a letter from Patagonia and Walmart saying, hey, we want to invite you to a conversation to talk about how we work together, it was received as the most unusual thing that people had ever gotten, right? But I think it really spoke to an understanding that at the time, companies, though they were doing a lot of really great work, they were working in silos, and they weren't actually making the kind of progress or really having the kind of impact that they wanted. They all had, there were good intentions. People had great social programs. People were working on the environment. Some were working on materials, but they were all working on islands, like, these kind of small islands of good within an organization, and not actually working together. And so Patagonia and Walmart said, hey, if we really want to do this, if we really want to transform this industry, we are going to have to work together, because individually as a company, we can only do so much, but collectively as a coalition, we can actually do a lot more. At the time, I was working at Gap Inc., and I was at the third meeting of the SAC before it was even a formal organization. And as an anecdote, I'm sitting around the table, and there's Patagonia, there's Walmart, there's Target, there's us, and manufacturers. And I walked out of that meeting thinking that was both the weirdest meeting I've ever been at, and also maybe the coolest meeting I've ever been at. But I didn't even know what to think of it at the time. And so, from that, these companies basically got together and said, okay, look, if we are going to work together, we need to figure out how you actually standardize sustainability measurement, right? Each company cannot be doing this on their own, looking at things in an individual way, and trying to figure out how you compare apples to apples, right? You have to have a standardized measurement. And you have to look at metrics that actually matter, right? Things that actually are going to move the needle, things that are going to have a real impact, versus auditing, let's say, how high that fire extinguisher, which at the end of the day is not actually the point. The point is, do you have one, right? So asking the right set of questions, making sure everyone is aligned on those set of questions, and actually the metrics that matter is how the SAC got started and how the Higg Index, which measures environmental and social sustainability end to end, was actually born. For us as a coalition, that really has been the point, is to bring the industry together from a pre-competitive standpoint and to actually talk about all of these issues, both from a social and environmental perspective, and talk about how do you standardize measurement and how do you drive collective action as an industry. And that goal hasn't really changed in the past 14 years.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that context. And then I guess, you're working across the world with various stakeholders. So in that work, where do you feel like we are currently as far as the industry goes, the global fashion industry, when it comes to addressing the issues with sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really important things, and it has been touched on throughout the day, that has been so critical and such a principal part of the SAC is around equal partnership, right? So when the SAC was founded, it was not just brands and retailers. It was a really cognizant and intentional setup to say, if you're going to address the industry, you have to bring every part of the value chain together. It has to be brands, retailers, manufacturers, NGOs, academics, government organizations, service providers, because everybody touches a part of this, right? And I think that is kind of one of the challenges is when you bring every part of the value chain together, like you're gonna have a lot of really intense conversations, and collaboration isn't always easy because you have people who have various perspectives, but the challenge and the opportunity comes in how you collaborate and how you start to align those efforts together. And as an industry, I feel like we've actually made a ton of really great progress. So 14 years later, the fact that the SAC has now over 280 companies working together, over 20,000 companies who are leveraging the Higg Index, that's a huge amount of progress. But the problem is the urgency of this moment requires that we move together much faster and that we accelerate action and that we actually collaborate even more intentionally than I think we ever have. And so I do believe that we've made good progress, but we still have a ways to go. But I think that principle of bringing every part of the value chain and equal partnership and really co-creating solutions is the way forward for this industry, right? We can't have it be a global north, global south conversation. We can't have it be a brand versus manufacturer conversation. It has to be one conversation that we're having and really thinking about how do we co-create the solutions that are going to drive this industry forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the ways that you're doing that is through the Higg, through these various tools that you offer for brands to help address the fashion industry's, environmental and social impact. And one of the SIC's tools that has received criticism is the consumer-facing transparency program pilot. And I think that may be something that a lot of folks have read about in the news or have heard about and are maybe confused about or would like to know more information. So I guess to start, it would be really helpful to hear from your lens, what is this program? Like, what was this pilot program? What was the criticism it received? And then why was it halted?
Sure. And I might start with just kind of the Higg suite for those who don't know as much about it. So the Higg Index suite of tools is actually comprised of 5 different tools, right? And when the SAC was first started, it was really with an understanding that companies could not be measuring just one part of this, right? So it wasn't enough to just measure facility performance or materials or brand performance. You had to look at it holistically, right? You had to measure everything from the materials that you make to the products that those materials go into, to where it's being produced from a facility perspective, to brand performance, right? So we actually have 5 tools. So, there is the Higg brand and retail module, the Higg product module, the Higg material sustainability index, which feeds into the product module, and then the facility tools, which look at both environmental and social labor, right? And that was so that brands and retailers and manufacturers were actually looking at this holistically, right? We're looking at all of these metrics from a social and environmental perspective. And so that's number one, is that these measurement tools are meant to be holistic and they're meant to capture the entire value chain. The second part of it is that I want to start with what was the impetus for the transparency program to begin with. For us at the SAC, transparency has been built in from the very beginning. And that's because we realize that transparency is incredibly important to drive greater visibility and to drive accountability, right? So that is kind of the core of at the SAC when we first started, is how do you put trusted, credible data in the hands of decision makers. And that's not just brands and retailers, it's also ultimately stakeholders, it's governments, and it's consumers, right? And the theory of change there is that if you can put trusted, credible data or information in the hands of decision makers, wherever they sit in the value chain, right? If they're B2B or if they're looking at consumers or if they're engaging with stakeholders, that it helps them to not only understand their impact, but it helps them to be able to do something about it. Right? So that is kind of the core philosophy. We started working on the transparency program actually in 2014, right? Which is, how do you actually start to communicate information to various stakeholders? So how are companies using it from a B2B perspective? So how are brands and retailers using this information with their suppliers? How are brands and retailers potentially going to communicate this to consumers? And we started actually testing and piloting this, which is, what does consumer-facing communication look like that puts this type of data that is verified in the hands of consumers so that they understand it. I think someone earlier brought up, the nutrition label. So Frank was talking about the impact index, right? And like, how do you start to, even at the SAC, it was like, oh yeah, wouldn't it be great if you could have this information like a nutrition label that would be that easy, right? Turns out that's actually very hard to do. And there are millions of data points that go into it. And we did 2 years of consumer testing, where we looked at consumer sentiment. We actually tested it in 3 different regions. And we looked at, well, what information do consumers want to see? What makes sense, right? We have millions of data points from across the entire value chain, everything from, chemical information, facility information, brand information, material information. Turns out consumers, that's too much. They don't want that information, right? It's not easy for them to actually understand. What do I do with this? What does this mean? Is there a value judgment? So we did 2 years of consumer testing, and then we actually ended up doing a report in 2019 with GlobeScan that was the result of that, which is, okay, well, what does this tell us? And then we actually took a whole nother year to say, based on this insight from this report and from this consumer testing, how do we actually evolve, this program to start to pilot this type of information with consumers? And so we started with materials, which is based on the Higg Material Sustainability Index, which looks at, okay, well, what is the material in a product, right? So let's say the cotton makeup in a cotton t-shirt. So 2021, we basically piloted this with 3 member organizations who were looking at several hundred products where we were putting out information around the material makeup of a product that they had online, right? So for instance, you would go to an online product page, you would see, here's the product, here's all of this other information about it, and then we were looking at the material composition. And so it was looking at material to material. So it was saying, okay, well, if this is a cotton t-shirt, and it's made out of, what is the material environmental impact of this cotton t-shirt from, let's say, conventional cotton to recycled cotton, right? So it's comparing the same fiber, right? It's not comparing, cotton to polyester. It's only comparing cotton to cotton, conventional cotton to recycled, or conventional, polyester to recycled polyester, right? So it's kind of showing you the environmental impact of that. And really, it was a test, right? It was to say, okay, well, is this information useful? Do consumers, want to see this? What resonates, and what is the impact of that? Now, obviously, we know that it doesn't stop with the material, right? There's so much other information, but it was a first step. And then, ultimately, the vision is, okay, well, then you can start to layer on other information, right? Eventually, you can put in facility information, brand information, et cetera. We had also done due diligence with regards to regulation. So there's been a lot of conversation here around, regulation that's coming down the pipeline, especially in the EU, with regards to what kind of information can you communicate to consumers? What kinds of claims can you make? Right? So we had done some due diligence around existing directives in the EU, which, just as a side note, directives are not necessarily regulation, right? Directives are guidance that say, okay, well, here's the types of things that you can and you should be communicating. And we looked at that and we said, okay, well, to the best of trying to follow the directive, this is what it means. And what happened is in Norway, a directive means that each member state within the EU can interpret that directive in different ways, right? Because it's not specific. It's not specific legislation, and there's not necessarily a specificity within the member state for how they interpret it. So within Norway, we had conversations with the NCA, so the Norwegian Consumer Authority, and their interpretation of the directive basically led them to say, well, we think that this type of information could be misleading to consumers, right? And their interpretation of the directive was that it could be misleading because of a couple of different points. So number one, it's based on global average data, which they said was not necessarily specific enough, right? So if you were not talking about the specific cotton that went into a cotton t-shirt that was being sold, that wasn't granular enough data. So the use of global average data was not sufficient. The second thing that they said was that if the LCAs, or the life cycle assessment data that this is based on, are outdated by a certain time frame, then those LCAs needed to be updated, right? And then the third thing was that by looking only at the environmental impact of a material, it actually left out a lot of other impacts, which obviously, as I stated, we already knew was true, right? So their interpretation was that if it was not necessarily inclusive of other impacts, that could be misleading to consumers. And so we had a long dialogue. We kind of went back and forth with them to really understand, okay, this is helpful, but let's talk about how the industry gets from here in terms of where we are and what we know and what we understand today and the data that we have to ultimately where we want to go as an industry. And so we've had, kind of ongoing conversations with them. What they ended up issuing then in October of 2022 was essentially guidance, right? Which is, okay, if you are going to use the Higg Material Sustainability Index to make certain claims, then here's the guidance by which you could use that. So it wasn't a legal ruling also, because the NCA is not an enforcement agency. And they said that ultimately it's going to be a case-by-case basis. Now, because of that, we ended up kind of pausing the transparency program so that we could do two things. One is so that we could better understand the guidance, also from a legal perspective, because they said any claim that you make ultimately has to go through a legal review, right? Which would mean that we would need to kind of take a step back, take a look at what we were doing, make sure that it was compliant with kind of local, well, here in this case, local law, as well as potentially EU regulation. And so we've taken a step back. We continue to engage with, the authorities both in Norway and kind of other member states to try to understand how do we figure out how to harmonize the guidance and the legislation to allow for a common approach, right? So, the SAC has always been looking at how do you harmonize approaches? So how do you harmonize and standardize tools? And in this case, how can we harmonize and standardize legislation so that companies actually understand what is required, right? Because that is really important. If you want to be able to communicate claims to consumers, trying to do it on a country-by-country basis is going to be incredibly challenging for any company to be able to comply with, right? And the lack of specificity or the ability for member states to actually interpret any sort of directive or guidance, such as the Substantiating Green Claims Directive, which also just came out from the EU, if that interpretation is left open to each member state, it will cause essentially a patchwork approach to legislation that also ultimately makes it harder. From our perspective, we think that the objective is how do you put trusted, credible data in the hands of both consumers and decision makers, which means we need to create a harmonized approach also from a policy perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing that additional context. Before we get into more of like how we move forward from this point, I just want to touch on one other element that has come up a lot amongst my circles, where I hear folks have kind of expressing frustrations about the Higg MSI and explaining that like they voiced concerns about the scope of the program in the past, but never received a response. So like things like questioning why it didn't include end of life and disposable, so the tool wouldn't skew towards sort of favoring plastics, or frustrations that the tool was, industry created instead of being more backed by unbiased folks from academia or the scientific community. And then when the NCA gave the ruling, I think for these folks, it suddenly seemed like from their lens that, oh, now the SIC is listening. Why didn't they listen to me before? So I guess, you're creating tools for such a massive, very complicated industry. Nothing about this is simple. And so there's going to be so many perspectives and so many priorities depending on who you're talking to. So I guess I'm really curious how you address and integrate feedback that you get from industry or from other folks on different aspects that you're trying to create.
Sure. And I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about how we create tools, because the tools are not created by like SAC staff, right? So number one, that's really important to know. Our tools are actually created by members, right? Which means that as an organization that represents almost 50% of the industry, we actually represent a pretty big swath of industry engagement and involvement. And so our members actually get together. And when you say like our members, I think it's also really important to think about the people that the SAC actually engages with. So we're working directly with the sustainability teams at each of these companies. So it is the people who are, on the social and the environmental sustainability teams, often the material teams, who have a huge amount of deep expertise and knowledge around a lot of these issues. They participate in tool development to help create the tools. So again, we're actually trying to bring the best insight and expertise that we possibly can to these tools. The other thing is that these tools constantly evolve, right? They are never static. And so they continue to get updated based on both the best science as well as when industry issues start to arise and how they change and they evolve. And so the tools evolve with them. I think when we look at, let's say, the Higg Facility Environmental Module, we're on version 4 that gets released later this year, which means that we actually update the tools as we get feedback from the industry, not just from members, but also from users, right? So when facilities actually bring feedback to us, a lot of that feedback is synthesized, a lot of it is incorporated, it's reviewed, and then we often go through external review as well. So the MSI was last reviewed from an external stakeholder perspective, which had academics, LCA experts who looked at it in 2016, and we're going through another external independent review of that this year. And so our tools do go through both stakeholder engagement, member engagement, and external review on a constant basis. Now, to your point around people have raised issues get raised all the time with all of the tools, right? And the question becomes, how do you start to incorporate that feedback and how do the tools evolve? Some of the feedback that we get around, well, do the tools incorporate this or that, such as microfiber shedding? Well, absolutely they will when there is a clear, consistent, and aligned scientific standard for how you measure that. Right? So if there is something that is not included, it may also be that it's not included because there is not a scientific consensus or standard for how you measure something, right? And until that happens, those things can't be included in the tools because then they do end up being subjective, right? So our tools evolve as the science evolves and as they continue to actually get feedback and use throughout the industry. The other thing that I think is important is that the Higg Material Sustainability Index is based on life cycle assessment data, life cycle assessment analysis, or LCAs, which do only measure a certain, they only measure cradle to gate, right? So they're measuring from extraction to basically when it leaves the factory. The Higg product module does take it a step further, so it's not like there's not a tool that actually does that doesn't address durability and end of life. It does, but it is a separate tool, and the Higg MSI feeds into that, right? So it's also about how do you use these tools in conjunction with one another to understand, and you understand the limitations of one tool and where another tool picks up. Right? So these tools are not meant to be used only in isolation. They're actually meant to be used together. And it was done purposely so that companies do understand the holistic impacts, but can use the tools to also understand aspects of their programs, such as their material portfolio or their supply chain. So, I think those are really important aspects of the tools as well.
Yeah, thank you. I have one more follow-up question because you mentioned the microplastics element. I was talking to a friend of mine who's been on my podcast before, and she's a scientist, and she researches microplastics and how they impact, urban environments. And she said that there are tools that they use and specific tools to collect information on microplastics. So when you say a scientific, sort of industry-wide, what is it that meets that standard, I guess, that would be the expectation where you're okay, now that's an industry-wide scientific measurement that we can use?
Yeah, there are a lot of groups who are working on it. What I will say is, but if there are a bunch of different tools in terms of how you measure it, I think that becomes challenging. And so, there is the Microfiber Consortium who's also working on it. Once there is I think greater alignment on that, we would absolutely include it. Right? So it's not to say that we're not looking at it. It's not to say that we're not engaging with stakeholders around it. But I do think that kind of broad consensus around, how do you measure it? What is the impact of it, et cetera? When that is reached, we would evolve the tools to also meet that.
Okay, got it. Well, we're here now. I think it's nice to understand context and address concerns, but it's also important to figure out ways to move forward. I think a lot of people are probably interested to learn more about how you're potentially using this as an opportunity to, further lean into your leadership and addressing accountability. You've mentioned these tools and all these different layers connected to them. I guess, what are some of the ways that you're evolving them, not only because of, industry or external feedback, but also just because, like you mentioned earlier, you're always evolving them. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ways that you're evolving them and kind of looking to the future?
Sure. So we just launched recently an update to the Hague brand and retail module, which I think is an incredible update because it starts to also incorporate new issues that people are talking about, such as biodiversity and circularity, right? So as I mentioned, the tools continue to evolve, and the new framework for the brand and retail module actually is focused on an ESG perspective. So it's really looking at environmental factors, social factors, and governance factors, right? So again, like as kind of regulation comes down the pipeline, it starts to align with, corporate reporting directives as well as due diligence frameworks. And the industry is rapidly changing, right? So as the industry changes, as legislation comes, the tools will also continue to evolve. But incorporating new topics and really starting to address things like biodiversity, circularity, or in the case of some of the facility environmental module tools, looking at how do you capture more regular data around emissions? How do you start to capture greenhouse gas emissions and make sure that people are looking at that in the right way. So all of those things will continue to evolve as the tools do, and as people use the tools, and as the science evolves as well.
And then there's a new initiative. You have the decarbonization program, which I've heard a lot about lately. So I guess, can you walk us through a little bit about what that's about and how you're kind of approaching that?
Sure. So at the SAC, we have membership requirements for members. And so in this case, what that means is that all brands, retailers, and manufacturers are actually required to set a science-based target. So the first part of that is, okay, how do we drive greater accountability within the coalition? But the other part is that setting the target is not enough, right? You actually have to help people figure out how to do that. And so we launched our decarbonization program last year, which really seeks to help all members, so brands, retailers, and manufacturers, set their science-based target and actually figure out the pathway to achieving it, right? Because setting a goal is great, but if you don't know how to get there and you don't know how to kind of measure the right things and be able to manage that, you're not going to achieve it. Right. And we're not here to just set companies up to set goals. We're here to try to actually transform the industry. And so the decarbonization program has been great because we've developed guidance for brands, retailers, and manufacturers, like step by step, working with the SBTi and really making sure that we're providing the right guidance for companies to understand, like, what is the step-by-step process by which I do this, right? How do I gather the right information? How do I make sure it's aligned? How can I actually get this goal approved? And then the other thing is actually creating, cohorts of organizations working together to leverage best practice. I think one of the most incredible things about the SAC and the community is that we have built a really robust community, and some of the best learnings come from actually companies engaging with each other and figuring out how one company has done it versus another, and actually sharing those learnings across the coalition has been massively beneficial and has helped companies progress beyond where they initially were just by having those conversations and being able to connect. So in this way, we can actually connect companies who have set a science-based target already and looking at the pain points and the challenges and connect them with those who are just getting started, right? So this realization that like every company is on their own sustainability journey and they're at vastly different points is hugely important to then help actually bring everyone along and like help raise all boats. And so it's not just about kind of guidance, it's not just about setting goals, but it's also about like leveraging the community and the best practice to really help everyone achieve these targets together. And I think that is one of the great things for me that's always been incredible about the SAC community and working with these people who are so passionate because they actually they want to share, they want to help. They want to help others figure out and actually move past the pain points that they might have had to bring them along. It's also about how they partner together. So brands and retailers, someone earlier said, okay, well, 95% of the impact's in the supply chain. Absolutely true, which means brands and retailers need to be working in partnership with their supply chain, right? It's not about mandating a target and then just seeing what happens. It's about actually saying, how do we reach these goals together? If as a brand or retailer, you've set a science-based target, it means that you have to work with your supply chain partners to figure out how you are collectively going to get there together. And that means there's a lot of dialogue and engagement. We're setting up regional meetings to actually engage suppliers in 3 different sourcing countries this year. We'll be talking about it in June at Planet Textiles as well. And so continuing to have these conversations and drive this kind of engagement is hugely important and is necessary for companies to be able to achieve these targets together.
Yeah, absolutely. If we zoom out a little bit, I feel like the majority of folks here understand the complexities of like a global supply chain and how none of this is simple and there's a lot of challenges involved. And one thing I know that Brittany, wherever she is, brings up a lot is like we don't have an industry-wide, let alone globally recognized definition of sustainability and the challenges that can come with that. So in building these tools at the SAC, what are some of the challenges that you face when there is no, globally recognized, understood sustainability definition?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think about it less as like having an exact common definition of sustainability. I mean, even earlier on the first panel, there wasn't a common definition of circularity, right? And yet, I don't know that should stop us from doing all the things we know have to be done anyways, right? So some of this is not super exciting, but things like energy efficiency and, things like tracking, metrics like water and wastewater and chemicals and inputs, like these are all things that for the past 20, 30 years, like we know we have to do anyways, right? And so I think it's really more about, for us, it's making sure that you understand your impacts, right? You can't manage, we say it all the time, you can't manage what you can't measure, right? No company out there would be like, I'm not entirely sure about my finances, like I don't know how much I spend and how much I make, right? Like nobody would say that. And we talk about it saying, well, you need to understand your supply chain and your impacts in the same way you understand your money, right? So you need to understand your impacts and what those are, and where they're coming from and what those hotspots are. And then you need to be managing those impacts and actually moving towards kind of that positive impact, right? So how are you reducing your energy usage? How are you shifting away from coal to renewables? How are you reducing your water? How are you reducing, chemical inputs? Like those are the important things that I think we all know need to happen. And while it would be great to have a universally accepted, complete definition that everyone would agree on for sustainability or circularity, that would be great. I think I would not want to see that stop us from doing all the work that we know has to get done.
Mm-hmm. I know we need to wrap it up, but I want to close just briefly with your thoughts. So I feel like there are a lot of really like extreme binary reactions to things currently in the sustainability space. It's like either okay, this is a great start, let's evolve it from here, or the reaction is tear it all down and start fresh, And I think there's valid points on both sides there, but for me, I always kind of try to find like, what's the middle ground? What's the gray area? What's this sort of in between the binary thinking? And so I'm curious from your perspective, what does collective collaboration truly mean, and how can we get everyone on board in a short response, if you can?
Sure, okay. I don't know if I can have a short response to that, but I will try. Okay, so I will say that I think we don't have time to start over, right? We just don't. So bottom line is we've got 7, probably less years to actually address some of the worst impacts of climate change that are going to have a massive impact on people on the planet. So we don't have time to start all over. And there has been a lot of really good work done, right? So I believe that we should be building on the good existing work that has been done. And that means that collaboration is really about assuming good intent and building from a place of trust. For me, when I go back to some of the earliest conversations at the SAC, people would, in all honesty, have very serious disagreements with each other, right? But they didn't assume ill intent. So there would be yelling matches of people talking about how they do this or that, but then people go out and have a drink, and because they assumed they're all trying to do the right thing, right? They're all in there trying to make a positive difference and a contribution to people and the planet. And assuming that good intent has to be the basis of how we do this work as a community. And so if we're out there vilifying or demonizing, people or companies or whatever, I don't know that that helps us actually work together, right? If it's binary and it's this or it's that, it's my way or it's your way, like that is not a road to collaboration. And I think we've seen that at the SAC is that you have to be able to sit around the table, you have to be able to have dialogue and have discussion, and you have to be able to find common ground, and you have to be able to find a path forward. And that sometimes means compromise. It sometimes means that it's not one way or the other. It's something that is co-created together that people believe is the right direction and moves us forward. Earlier, someone said, it's about progress, not perfection. And that's been a mantra at the SAC forever, right? It is about how do we make progress. It's not about being perfect, but if we are going to get there, the only way we're going to get there is together, and that togetherness has to be built on good intent and trust.
Thank you so much, Amina, for this conversation.